So here's something you probably haven't thought about in a while. Right now, as you're lying there, you're surrounded by more communication than any human being in history could have imagined. Signals are passing through your walls. Wi-Fi, cellular data, Bluetooth, radio waves carrying television and AM talk shows, and air traffic control chatter. Satellites overhead are beaming GPS coordinates and weather data, and television signals and phone calls down through the atmosphere. Somewhere on the ocean floor, fiber optic cables thinner than a garden hose are carrying 95% of all intercontinental data, emails, stock trades, video calls, the entire pulsing nervous system of global civilization, as flickers of light through glass. And if you picked up your phone right now, you could send a message to someone on the other side of the planet, and they'd have it in less than a second. Less than a second. Think about that. A thought in your head, translated into words, encoded as electrical signals, bounced off a tower, relayed through fiber and copper and orbiting machinery, decoded, and delivered to another human brain, all in the time it takes to blink. And yet, for most of human history, for almost all of it really, if you wanted to tell someone something and they weren't standing right next to you, you were basically out of luck. The entire history of communication is, in a very real sense, the history of humans trying to solve one deceptively simple problem. How do I get a thought out of my head and into yours when you're not here? That's it. That's the whole story. And it turns out to be one of the most fascinating, consequential, and genuinely dramatic stories in all of human civilization. Because every time someone figured out a new way to move information across distance or preserve it across time, the world changed, not a little, profoundly. The invention of writing, the printing press, the telegraph, the telephone, the internet. Each one of these didn't just make communication faster or easier. Each one restructured society, changed how governments work, how economies function, how wars are fought, how people fall in love, how cultures form and dissolve and blend together. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. The whole story. From the very beginning, from the first time a human being made a mark on a cave wall and thought, someone will see this after I'm gone, all the way to the world you're lying in right now, drowning in more information than you could process in 1,000 lifetimes. We'll take it slow. There's no rush at all. If you drift off along the way, that's fine. The story will still be here. Let's start where it starts. Before writing, before language even, there was something more fundamental. The human need to communicate, to share, to say, look at this, or I was here, or danger. And the oldest evidence we have of that impulse is paint on stone. The cave paintings at Lascaux in southern France are about 17,000 years old. The ones at Chauvet, also in France, are more than 30,000. And the paintings at Sulawesi in Indonesia might be even older. Some have been dated to at least 45,000 years ago. These aren't crude stick figures. Some of them are breathtakingly beautiful. Herds of horses in motion, bison caught mid-charge, deer with antlers that seem to branch into the rock itself. The artists who made them understood perspective, shading, the illusion of movement. They used the natural contours of the cave walls to give their animals three-dimensional form. These were skilled people, and they went deep underground, far from daylight, carrying animal fat lamps that flickered in the darkness to make images that no sunlight would ever touch. Now, were these paintings communication? That's a question archaeologists and anthropologists have argued about for decades, and honestly, we don't know for certain. They might have been ritual, they might have been art for art's sake, though that concept probably didn't exist yet in the way we think of it. They might have been teaching tools, showing young hunters what the prey animals looked like and how they moved. But here's what we do know. They were intentional marks, made to persist. Someone put information into a durable form so that it would outlast the moment of its creation. And that, when you strip away everything else, is the seed of all communication technology. Every letter you've ever written, every book on your shelf, every text you've ever sent, it all grows from the same root impulse. Make a mark, leave a trace, let something survive beyond the breath that carries it. But paint on a cave wall has limits. It can show you a bison, but it can't tell you that the bison was spotted near the river 3 days ago and it was limping. It can communicate images, but not complex ideas, not sequences of events, not abstract thoughts. For that, you need something more flexible. You need language. And language, spoken language, is almost certainly far, far older than any cave painting. How old, we genuinely don't know. There are no fossils of speech. Sound doesn't leave marks on bone. Estimates vary wildly. Some linguists and anthropologists think structured spoken language emerged somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago. Others push it back further, arguing that Homo erectus, our predecessor species, may have had some form of proto-language over 1 million years ago. The anatomical evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. We can look at the size of the hypoglossal canal in fossil skulls. That's the channel for the nerve that controls the tongue, and at the position of the larynx, and at the shape of the hyoid bone, and make inferences about whether a species could have produced the range of sounds that human speech requires. But having the hardware doesn't mean you're running the software. We might never know exactly when the first human being strung sounds together into a sentence and waited for a response. What we do know is that spoken language changed everything. It allowed humans to coordinate in ways no other species could match. You could plan a hunt days in advance. You could warn someone about a danger they hadn't seen yet. You could teach a child something you'd learned from your grandmother, who had learned it from hers. Spoken language created the possibility of culture, of accumulated knowledge passing from generation to generation, growing and refining over time, building on itself in ways that purely genetic transmission never could. But spoken language has a fundamental limitation that you've probably never thought about, because it's so obvious it's invisible. Speech is ephemeral. The moment a word leaves your mouth, it begins to die. Sound waves dissipate. The air molecules return to their random motion. Unless someone is there to hear it, the message is gone. And even if someone does hear it, memory is fallible. Try to repeat a story you heard a week ago, and you'll change it. Not on purpose. Your brain just doesn't store information the way a hard drive does. Details shift. Emphasis changes. Names get muddled. This is why oral traditions, as rich and remarkable as they are, tend to drift over time. The Iliad was passed down orally for centuries before anyone wrote it down, and we can only guess at how much it changed in the telling. So for tens of thousands of years, human communication was limited by 2 constraints. You had to be within earshot, and nothing persisted beyond memory. Every generation had to relearn from the previous one through direct contact. Knowledge could accumulate, but slowly, and it was always fragile. A single broken chain of transmission, a village destroyed by disease, a storyteller who died young, and centuries of accumulated wisdom could simply vanish. And that's exactly what happened, over and over, across the long millennia of human prehistory. We'll never know how much was lost, but then, about 5,000 years ago, give or take, something extraordinary happened. In a hot, flat river valley between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in what is now southern Iraq, someone pressed a pointed reed into a lump of wet clay and made a mark that meant something specific. Not a picture of a thing, but a symbol that represented a thing. And with that small act, that seemingly modest innovation, the entire trajectory of human civilization changed. Because that was writing. And writing didn't just solve the persistence problem. It cracked it wide open, in ways that its inventors couldn't possibly have foreseen, and that we're still living with today. So let's talk about how writing was born, because the story is more complicated and more fascinating than most people realize. The civilization that invented writing, or at least the earliest writing system we have solid evidence for, was Sumer. The Sumerians lived in Mesopotamia, in city-states like Uruk, and Lagash, starting around 4500 BCE or so. And here's what's important to understand. They didn't invent writing because they wanted to record poetry or history or religious texts. They invented it to keep track of grain. That might sound anticlimactic, but think about what was happening. These were some of the first large, complex, agricultural societies in human history. They'd figured out irrigation, they were farming at scale, they were storing surplus grain in communal granaries. And once you have surplus, you have a problem. Who contributed what? Who's owed what? How much barley went into that storehouse last month, and how much went out? If you're a village of 50 people, you can probably keep track of this in your head, or settle disputes by asking around. But when you're a city of 10 or 20,000, memory isn't enough. You need records. So around 3400 BCE, in the city of Uruk, which may have been the largest city in the world at that time, with a population of perhaps 40,000, people started using small clay tokens to represent commodities. A cone-shaped token for a measure of grain, a sphere for a bushel, a cylinder for an animal. These tokens had been around in various forms for thousands of years, actually. They've been found at archaeological sites dating back to 8000 BCE, but around 3400, someone had a new idea. Instead of carrying the tokens around, why not press them into the surface of a wet clay tablet, making an impression of the token? Now you have a permanent record. You can count the impressions. You can store the tablet. You can verify a transaction later. And here's where it gets really interesting. Once people started making impressions of tokens in clay, they realized they didn't actually need the tokens anymore. You could just draw the shape of the token with a stylus. And once you're drawing shapes instead of pressing objects, you can start simplifying those shapes, making them faster to draw, more standardized. The drawings became more abstract. A picture of a grain stalk became a few quick wedge-shaped marks, and those marks are what we call cuneiform, from the Latin word for wedge, the world's first writing system. Now, early cuneiform was purely pictographic and ideographic. Each symbol represented a specific thing or concept. A picture of a head meant head. A picture of a foot meant to walk. But over the next several hundred years, something remarkable happened. The symbols started being used not just for the things they depicted, but for the sounds of the words for those things. If the Sumerian word for arrow sounded similar to the word for life, the arrow symbol could be used to write the word life, even though an arrow has nothing to do with being alive. This is called the rebus principle, and it's one of the most important conceptual leaps in the history of communication. Because once you're using symbols for sounds rather than things, you can write any word in the language, including abstract ones: justice, tomorrow, if, because. Words that have no physical form you could draw a picture of. You've made the jump from pictography to a genuine writing system. The Sumerians didn't get all the way to a true alphabet. Their system still used a mix of word signs and syllable signs, hundreds of them. And learning to read and write cuneiform was a specialized skill that took years of training. Scribes were an elite class. Literacy was rare. But the system worked, and it spread. The Akkadians adopted cuneiform for their own Semitic language. The Babylonians used it. The Assyrians used it. The Hittites, who spoke an Indo-European language in what's now Turkey, adapted it for their purposes. For nearly 3,000 years, Cuneiform was the dominant writing technology of the ancient Near East, used for everything from royal inscriptions to love letters to recipes. And around the same time, or possibly a few centuries later, the chronology is debated, a completely independent writing system was emerging along the Nile, Egyptian hieroglyphics. And the story there is different in texture, but similar in essence. The Egyptians developed a system that was partly logographic, symbols representing words, and partly phonetic, with symbols representing sounds. It was beautiful, elaborate, and deeply integrated into Egyptian culture and religion. The word hieroglyphic itself comes from the Greek for sacred carving, and the Egyptians had something the Sumerians didn't: papyrus. Instead of pressing marks into heavy clay tablets, Egyptian scribes could write with ink on thin sheets made from the papyrus reed that grew abundantly along the Nile. Papyrus was lighter, easier to store, easier to transport, and you could write on it much faster than you could inscribe clay. This mattered. The medium shapes the message. When your writing surface is a heavy clay tablet, you tend toward brevity, short records, lists, receipts. When your writing surface is light and portable, you start writing longer things: letters, stories, administrative documents that run for pages. The technology of the medium expanded what writing could do. And speaking of papyrus and the expansion of written knowledge, let's take a small detour, because this is too good to skip. The Library of Alexandria, founded around 283 BCE by Ptolemy I of Egypt, or possibly his son Ptolemy II. The Library of Alexandria was the closest thing the ancient world had to the internet. It was a deliberate, systematic attempt to collect all of human knowledge in one place. Ships arriving at the port of Alexandria were reportedly searched, and any books found on board were confiscated, copied by scribes, and the copies returned to the owners, while the originals went into the library. At its peak, the library may have held somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. Those numbers come from ancient sources and are probably exaggerated, but even a fraction of that would have been extraordinary. The Library of Alexandria was more than a storage facility. It was a research institution, attached to a larger complex called the Mouseion, the museum, literally a temple to the muses, where scholars lived and worked at government expense. Euclid wrote his Elements there. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth there, getting remarkably close to the correct value using nothing but the angle of shadows and some basic geometry. Archimedes may have studied there. For centuries, it was the intellectual center of the Mediterranean world. And then it was gone. Not in a single dramatic fire. That's the popular story. But the reality is messier. The library declined over several centuries, damaged by fires, civil conflicts, and the gradual erosion of the Ptolemaic dynasty's support. By the time of the Arab conquest of Egypt in 641 CE, the Great Library was already a shadow of its former self, if it existed at all. What was lost is incalculable. We know the titles of some of the works that were there and are now gone: entire plays by Sophocles and Euripides, scientific treatises, philosophical works, histories. The library's fate is a reminder of something we talked about earlier. Knowledge stored in physical form is always vulnerable. A single disaster, a single act of neglect, and centuries of accumulated wisdom can vanish. The same vulnerability that made oral traditions fragile also applied, in a different way, to written ones. The medium is more durable than memory, but it's not indestructible. And then, somewhere around 1800 to 1050 BCE, the dating is uncertain and hotly debated. Something happened in the Eastern Mediterranean that might be the single most important innovation in the history of writing. Someone invented the alphabet, and that someone was almost certainly a Semitic-speaking people living in the Sinai Peninsula or the Levant, possibly Canaanites, possibly early Phoenicians, possibly workers in Egyptian turquoise mines who were familiar with hieroglyphics but weren't Egyptian themselves. The evidence is fragmentary. There are inscriptions found at Serabit el-Qadim in the Sinai, dating to perhaps 1800 BCE, that seem to be an early form of alphabetic writing. Scholars call it Proto-Sinaitic script. The symbols look like they were derived from Egyptian hieroglyphs, but repurposed to represent the first sound of the Semitic word for the thing the symbol depicted. So the hieroglyph for house, which in Semitic was something like bat, became the letter B. The hieroglyph for water, mayim, became the letter M. This is called the acrophonic principle, and it's basically how the alphabet was born. And here's the thing about the alphabet that made it so revolutionary. It was simple. Cuneiform had hundreds of signs. Egyptian hieroglyphics had hundreds more. Chinese would develop a writing system with thousands and thousands of characters. But an alphabet, a true alphabet, where each symbol represents a single sound, needs only a few dozen signs. The original Semitic alphabet had about 22. That's it, 22 symbols. And you can write any word in the language. You don't need years of specialized training. You don't need to be a member of an elite scribal class. A reasonably bright person can learn the basics in weeks, maybe less. And that changes everything about who gets to read and write. The Phoenicians, those great seafaring traders of the ancient Mediterranean, based in cities like Tyre and Sidon, and Byblos in what's now Lebanon, took this alphabet and ran with it. By around 150 BCE, they had a standardized 22-letter alphabet that they carried on their trading ships to every port in the Mediterranean. And everywhere they went, people adopted it. The Greeks encountered the Phoenician alphabet probably around the 9th or 8th century BCE, and they did something incredibly clever with it. They took some of the Phoenician letters that represented sounds Greek didn't have and repurposed them as vowels. The Phoenician alphabet, like most Semitic writing systems, only wrote consonants. You had to figure out the vowels from context. The Greeks said no, let's write everything, consonants and vowels both. The result was the first fully phonetic alphabet in history, and the ancestor of the Latin alphabet you're reading this in right now, or would be reading it in if you weren't listening to it. Same letters though. The letter A comes from the Phoenician aleph, which came from a Proto-Sinaitic sign that depicted an ox head turned upside down over the centuries until it became the shape you know. The letter B comes from Beth, house. These symbols have been on a journey of about 4,000 years, and they're still working. And the alphabet, once it existed, spread like nothing before it. The Etruscans took it from the Greeks. The Romans took it from the Etruscans. The Romans carried it across their empire, from Britain to North Africa to the borders of Persia. Meanwhile, from the same Phoenician root, the Aramaic alphabet evolved, which gave rise to Hebrew and Arabic scripts. In India, the Brahmi script, which may have been influenced by Aramaic, gave rise to the writing systems of Hindi, Bengali, Thai, Tibetan, and dozens of others. One way or another, nearly every alphabetic writing system on Earth traces back to that original Semitic innovation in the 2nd millennium BCE. One idea, rippling outward across millennia, reshaping every culture it touched. But let's slow down for a moment and think about what writing actually did to human society, because the effects were staggering, and some of them were not immediately obvious. The most basic thing writing did was defeat time. Before writing, knowledge lived in human brains and died with human bodies. After writing, knowledge could be stored outside any individual person. A farmer could die, but his observations about when to plant and when to harvest could survive on a tablet and be useful to someone he'd never meet. in a century he'd never see. This is so fundamental to how we live now that it's almost impossible to imagine the world without it. But try. Imagine that every piece of knowledge you have, everything you learned in school, every recipe, every law, every medical insight, every engineering principle, existed only in the memories of living people, and if those people died or forgot, it was gone. That was the human condition for hundreds of thousands of years. Writing changed it overnight, in evolutionary terms. And writing didn't just preserve knowledge, it made new kinds of knowledge possible. You can't do complex mathematics in your head. You need to write things down, manipulate symbols on a surface, build up chains of reasoning that are too long and too intricate to hold in working memory. The same is true for law, for philosophy, for science. Writing created the possibility of cumulative intellectual progress, the ability to stand on the shoulders of the previous generation's written work and see further. Without writing, there is no Euclid, no Aristotle, no Roman law, no Quran, no Principia Mathematica. The entire edifice of human intellectual achievement rests on the technology of making marks that persist. But here's something else writing did. Something a little more uncomfortable. It created new forms of power, because in the early millennia of writing, literacy was rare. In Sumer, in Egypt, in early China, the people who could read and write were a tiny elite, scribes, priests, bureaucrats, and the people who controlled the written records controlled the information, and the people who controlled the information controlled the society. Tax records, land ownership, legal judgments, royal decrees. All of it depended on writing, and all of it was mediated by a literate class that most ordinary people had no access to. Writing, in its earliest forms, was as much a tool of control as it was a tool of liberation. And that tension between communication technology as a tool of empowerment and communication technology as a tool of power is a theme we're going to see repeated over and over again throughout this story. It shows up with the printing press. It shows up with radio. It shows up with the internet. Every new communication technology simultaneously democratizes information and creates new hierarchies of access and control. Every single time. Now, let's keep moving through time, because something else was developing alongside writing. Something more ephemeral, but just as important. Systems for communicating across distance. Because writing solves the persistence problem, it lets information survive across time. But it doesn't, by itself, solve the distance problem. A clay tablet is durable, but it doesn't move itself. You need someone to carry it. And for most of ancient history, the speed of communication was the speed of a person on foot, or at best, a person on horseback. The Persians under Cyrus and Darius, around the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, built one of the first large-scale systems for moving messages quickly. The royal road stretched from Susa, near the Persian Gulf, to Sardis, near the Aegean coast of modern Turkey, about 1,700 miles. And along that road, at intervals of roughly a day's ride, there were relay stations with fresh horses and riders. A message could travel the entire length of the royal road in about 7 days. The Greek historian Herodotus was so impressed that he wrote a description of the Persian couriers that later became the unofficial motto of the United States Postal Service. You know the one. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night stops these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. That's not about American mailmen. That's about Persian horseback riders in the 5th century BCE. The Romans built something similar, the cursus publicus, a state-run postal system that used relay stations across their vast road network. And in China, the various dynasties maintained elaborate courier systems going back to at least the Shang dynasty around 1500 BCE. But all of these systems shared the same fundamental constraint. The message could only travel as fast as the messenger. Whether that messenger was a horse, a ship, or a man running on foot, the speed of communication was the speed of physical transport. And for thousands of years, nobody could figure out how to break that barrier. Well, that's not entirely true. There were a few clever workarounds. Smoke signals could transmit simple predetermined messages over line-of-sight distances. Indigenous peoples across the Americas used them, as did the Chinese along the Great Wall. The ancient Greeks used a system of fire beacons, torches lit on hilltops in relay, each one visible from the next, to send simple signals across hundreds of miles. According to tradition, a chain of fire beacons carried the news of the fall of Troy from Asia Minor to Argos in a single night. Whether that actually happened, or is just a dramatic detail in Aeschylus's play, is another question, but the technology was real. In the 2nd century BCE, the Greek historians Polybius described a more sophisticated beacon system that could actually encode alphabetic messages, different combinations of torches on 2 separate platforms, visible through telescopes, each combination corresponding to a letter. It was slow and cumbersome, but it worked. It was, in a very loose sense, the first telecommunications system. But these optical signaling systems had severe limitations. They required clear line of sight, so they were useless in bad weather, at night without fire, or over long distances with terrain in the way. They could transmit only slowly, and with high error rates. They were also conspicuous. Your enemy could see your signals too. For all practical purposes, communication over distance remained tied to physical transport for millennia. A letter written in Rome took weeks to reach the eastern provinces. News of a battle in a distant land might take months to arrive. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, it took days for the news to reach some parts of Italy, weeks to reach the edges of the empire. The world moved slowly, because information moved slowly, and information moved slowly, because nobody had yet figured out how to separate the message from the messenger. And that is the state of things for a very, very long time. Centuries pass. Empires rise and fall. The Roman Empire collapses in the West. The so-called Dark Ages settle over Europe, though calling them dark is unfair to the considerable intellectual activity that continued in monasteries, in the Islamic world, and in Byzantium. And throughout all of it, the basic mechanics of communication don't fundamentally change. People write things down on parchment or paper, and other people carry those written things from place to place. The medium improves. Paper arrives in Europe from China via the Islamic world in the 12th and 13th centuries, replacing the expensive and laborious parchment. But the underlying system is the same. Write it, carry it, deliver it. The speed of communication remains the speed of transport. But there's a revolution brewing, and its roots go back to something we haven't talked about yet. Something that's going to change not just how fast messages travel, but how many copies of a message can exist. And it starts, as so many world-changing innovations do, with a man whose personal life was kind of a mess, working on a project that almost bankrupted him. His name was Johannes Gutenberg, and what he was about to do in a workshop in Mainz, Germany, in the middle of the 15th century, would reshape human civilization more profoundly than almost any other single invention. And the thing is, he didn't invent any one new technology. What he did, and this is what makes it so brilliant, was combine several existing technologies in a way that nobody had thought to combine them before. The result was an explosion of information that the world had never seen, and the aftershocks are still reverberating today. But before we get to Gutenberg, we should talk about what printing looked like before him. Because he didn't invent printing from nothing. The Chinese had been printing for centuries. Woodblock printing, carving an entire page of text into a block of wood, inking it, and pressing it onto paper, was widespread in China by the Tang dynasty around the 7th century CE. The oldest known printed book is a Chinese copy of the Diamond Sutra, a Buddhist text, dated 868 CE, and around 1040, a Chinese artisan named Bi Sheng invented movable type, individual characters made from baked clay that could be rearranged to print different texts. It was an ingenious idea, but it had a practical problem in Chinese. The language uses thousands of distinct characters, so you needed an enormous set of type pieces, and arranging them was slow and complicated. Movable type never really took off in China the way it would in Europe, where alphabetic languages use only a few dozen distinct letters. It's one of those cases where the same invention has completely different impacts depending on the context it lands in. Korea actually had metal movable type before Gutenberg. The Jikji, a Korean Buddhist text, was printed with metal movable type in 1377, a good 70 years before Gutenberg's Bible. But the technology didn't spread the way it would in Europe, partly because of the Chinese character problem. Korean used a mix of Chinese characters and its own Hangul script, and partly because the social and economic conditions weren't quite right. The explosion that happened in Europe required a specific combination of factors that just happened to come together in the right place at the right time. And that brings us back to Johannes Gutenberg, born around 1400 in Mainz, a city on the Rhine in what's now Western Germany. Gutenberg came from a family with some money. His father was involved in the ecclesiastical mint, which is fitting given that metalworking would be central to his son's great innovation. Young Gutenberg probably trained as a goldsmith, and at some point he began experimenting with printing. The historical record is frustratingly sparse. We know remarkably little about the man who changed the world. Most of what we know comes from legal documents, and most of those are about lawsuits. Gutenberg was involved in a lot of lawsuits. Here's what he did, and why it mattered so much. Gutenberg solved several problems simultaneously. First, he developed a practical system for casting individual metal-type pieces. He created an adjustable mold. This is probably his most important single invention, that could be adjusted to cast letters of different widths. An M is wider than an I, after all. The mold was made of two L-shaped pieces that could slide against each other, and you'd pour a molten alloy, lead, tin, and antimony, a mixture that melted at a low temperature, filled the mold precisely, and hardened quickly, into the mold, and out would pop a single letter on a tiny metal block, perfectly consistent, ready to be used and reused thousands of times. Second, he developed an oil-based ink that would adhere to the metal type properly. The water-based inks used for woodblock printing didn't work on metal. Third, he adapted the screw press, which had been used for centuries to press olives and grapes, into a printing press that could apply even, firm pressure across a sheet of paper or vellum. None of these individual elements was entirely new. Metal casting was well known, oil-based preparations existed, screw presses were common, but Gutenberg put them together into a system, and the system worked. And the proof was the Gutenberg Bible, printed around 1455, a massive, beautiful book, 1,282 pages, set in a typeface that mimicked the handwriting of the best scribes. It was, by any standard, a masterpiece of printing. About 180 copies were produced, of which 49 survive today, and they are among the most valuable books in the world. But here's the truly revolutionary thing. Before Gutenberg, producing a book was agonizingly slow and expensive. A skilled scribe working full-time could copy maybe one book in several months. Every copy was made by hand, letter by letter, and every copy introduced new errors. A library of a few hundred volumes was considered exceptional. The entire library of the University of Cambridge in the 15th century had fewer than 300 books. And because books were so expensive, almost nobody had them. Knowledge was locked up in monasteries and universities, accessible only to the few. After Gutenberg, a single printing shop could produce hundreds of identical copies of a book in the time it would have taken a scribe to produce one. The cost per copy plummeted, and the effects cascaded outward faster than anyone could have predicted. By 1500, just 45 years after the Gutenberg Bible, there were printing presses in operation in more than 250 cities across Europe, and an estimated 20 million volumes had been produced. By 1600, that number was between 150 million and 200 million. Think about that growth rate. In the span of a century and a half, Europe went from a world where a single book was a treasure to a world drowning in printed material. And it wasn't just Bibles. It was scientific texts, political pamphlets, technical manuals, novels, poetry, news sheets, maps, calendars, almanacs, every kind of written knowledge, suddenly available to anyone who could read and afford a few coins. And this avalanche of printed material created demand for literacy, which in turn created more readers, which created demand for more books. It was a self-reinforcing cycle that accelerated the spread of knowledge faster than anything in human history up to that point. Martin Luther's 95 Theses, posted in 1517, would have been a local theological dispute in the pre-printing world. One more argument among monks that nobody outside the university would have heard about. But within weeks, printed copies had spread across Germany, within months across Europe. The Protestant Reformation, one of the most consequential movements in Western history, was, in a very real sense, powered by the printing press. Luther himself recognized this. He called printing God's highest and extremest act of grace, whereby the business of the gospel is driven forward, and he used it relentlessly, publishing pamphlets, translations, and treatises at a pace that would have been physically impossible before Gutenberg. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries was also deeply intertwined with printing. Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, all of them published their work in printed books that could be disseminated widely and debated by scholars across the continent. Before printing, a new scientific idea might take decades to spread, passed from hand to hand in expensive manuscripts. After printing, it could reach every university in Europe within months. Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, published in 1687, was available to any scholar with access to a bookshop. The acceleration of scientific progress in the early modern period is inseparable from the technology that made it possible. But let's not romanticize this too much. The printing press didn't just spread enlightenment and truth, it also spread propaganda, conspiracy theories, and hate. The anti-Semitic blood libel, the false accusation that Jews murdered Christian children, was amplified enormously by printed pamphlets in the 15th and 16th centuries. Political authorities quickly realized that the press could be dangerous, and censorship regimes sprang up almost immediately. The Catholic Church established the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of prohibited books, in 1559. Governments across Europe imposed licensing requirements on printers, attempting to control what could and couldn't be published. The tension between the democratizing power of communication technology and the desire of authorities to control information. There it is again. Same pattern, different century. And there's something else Gutenberg's invention did that's worth sitting with for a moment. It changed how people think, not metaphorically, literally. Before printing, reading was predominantly a communal, oral activity. Books were rare, so people gathered to hear them read aloud. Knowledge was shared socially, interpreted collectively. After printing, books became cheap enough for individuals to own, and reading became a private, silent activity. You could sit alone with a book, form your own interpretations, develop your own ideas without the mediating presence of a priest or a teacher or a community of listeners. The Protestant Reformation was, among other things, an assertion that individuals could read and interpret the Bible for themselves, without needing the church as an intermediary. That idea, that individual interpretation was valid, that you didn't need an institution to tell you what a text meant, is deeply connected to the technology that put books into individual hands for the first time. Some historians have argued that the entire concept of the individual, as we understand it in the modern West, is partly a product of print culture. That's a big claim, and it's debatable, but there's something to it. The printing press didn't just move information faster. It changed the relationship between people and knowledge, between individuals and institutions, in ways that are still playing out. So by the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, the information landscape has been utterly transformed compared to the ancient world. There are books everywhere. There are newspapers. The first regularly published newspapers appear in the early 17th century in Germany and the Netherlands. There's a functioning postal system in most European countries. The Royal Mail, in England, dates to 1516. Information travels across continents on ships, reaching the colonies in the Americas and Asia in weeks or months. It's vastly better than anything that existed before. But there's still that stubborn, fundamental constraint we talked about earlier. The message can only travel as fast as the messenger. A letter from London to New York takes 2 weeks by ship. News from India takes months. And in a world that's becoming increasingly interconnected, global trade, colonial empires, financial markets that span continents, the slowness of communication is becoming a real problem. Wars are fought and peace treaties signed before word of earlier events arrives. Ships are lost at sea, and no one knows for months. Market conditions change, and traders on the other side of the ocean are still operating on information that's weeks or months old. The world is ready for something new, something that can finally, after tens of thousands of years, break the link between the speed of communication and the speed of physical transport. Because by the 19th century, the frustration is palpable. Merchants are losing fortunes because price information travels too slowly. Generals are fighting battles based on orders that were issued weeks ago and may no longer be relevant. Families are separated by oceans and months of silence. The world has gotten bigger. Colonialism and global trade have stretched the distances that matter. But the speed of communication hasn't changed in any fundamental way since the Persian Royal Road. And that something is coming. It's going to emerge from an unlikely intersection of scientific curiosity, commercial ambition, and sheer stubbornness. And the man at the center of it is a portrait painter from Massachusetts, with no formal training in science or engineering, but an absolute conviction that electricity can carry messages across wires. His name was Samuel Morse, and the device he helped create, the electric telegraph, would be the first technology in human history to transmit information faster than a human being could physically travel. And that might not sound like a big deal in a world where you can video call someone on the other side of the planet. But in 1844, it was nothing short of miraculous. Now, to understand why the telegraph was such a thunderbolt, you need to understand the state of electrical science in the early 19th century. People had been playing with electricity for a while. Benjamin Franklin and his kite in 1752, Alessandro Volta's battery in 1800, and crucially, in 1820, a Danish physicist named Hans Christian Ørsted discovered something that changed everything. He noticed that when an electric current flowed through a wire, a nearby compass needle moved. Electricity created magnetism. That single observation, that there was a connection between these two apparently separate forces, opened the door to electromagnetism, and eventually to the telegraph, the telephone, radio, and everything that followed. Within a year of Ørsted's discovery, scientists across Europe were experimenting with electromagnetic signaling. André-Marie Ampère in France suggested that electrical signals could be used for communication. Various inventors proposed telegraph systems of varying complexity. Some used multiple wires, some used chemical reactions, some used deflecting needles. In 1833, two German scientists, Carl Friedrich Gauss and Wilhelm Weber, actually built a working electromagnetic telegraph line about a mile long in Göttingen and used it to exchange messages. In 1837, William Fothergill Cooke and Charles Wheatstone demonstrated a commercial telegraph system on the Great Western Railway in England, using multiple needles that pointed to letters on a diamond-shaped grid. It worked, and it was used commercially for several years. So when Samuel Morse enters the story, he's not inventing the concept of electrical telegraphy from scratch. Other people had the same idea. What Morse contributed, with crucial help from a few collaborators, was a system so practical, so simple, and so well suited to long-distance use that it became the global standard. And the story of how he got there is, like so many stories in the history of communication, deeply human. Morse was born in 1791 in Charlestown, Massachusetts. His father was a Calvinist minister and geographer. Young Samuel showed talent as an artist and went to London to study painting. He was good, genuinely good. He painted portraits of distinguished Americans, including a famous one of the Marquis de Lafayette. He dreamed of being a great history painter, of creating monumental canvases that would hang in the Capitol. But commercial success eluded him. Portrait painting paid the bills, barely, and the grand commissions he longed for never came. And then, in 1825, tragedy struck. His young wife, Lucretia, fell ill and died while Morse was away painting a portrait of Lafayette in Washington, D.C. By the time he received the letter telling him she was sick, she was already dead and buried. He never got to say goodbye. The letter had traveled by horse, a few days faster, and he might have made it home in time. That experience haunted Morse, and several years later, in 1832, on a ship returning from Europe, he found himself in a conversation about electricity with a fellow passenger, a chemist named Charles Thomas Jackson. Jackson described the recent experiments with electromagnetism, and Morse was electrified, if you'll excuse the pun. He became convinced that electrical signals could be used to send messages over long distances, instantly, and from that point on, painting became secondary. He spent the next 12 years, working on the telegraph, often in near poverty, borrowing money, begging for government funding, enduring skepticism and rejection, and setback after setback. Now, Morse himself was not an electrical engineer or a scientist. He was a painter, and the technical development of his telegraph system relied heavily on two people who don't get nearly enough credit. The first was Leonard Gale, a chemistry professor at New York University, who helped Morse understand the electrical principles involved and suggested crucial improvements, like using relay magnets to boost the signal over long distances. The second, and arguably the more important, was Alfred Vail, a skilled mechanic and inventor from a wealthy family of industrialists. Vail refined Morse's crude prototype into a practical machine, improved the mechanical components, and, this is significant, played a major role in developing the code, Morse code. That elegant binary system of dots and dashes, short and long signals, that could encode any letter of the alphabet. The basic idea was Morses, represent letters as combinations of two simple signals. But the specific assignment of codes to letters, the optimization that gave the most common letters the shortest codes, was worked out collaboratively, with Vail doing much of the detailed work. The letter E, the most common letter in English, is a single dot, T is a single dash, A is dot dash. The less common letters get longer codes. Q is dash dash dot dash. It's an early and remarkably effective example of what we'd now call data compression, and it meant that a skilled operator could transmit about 15 to 20 words per minute, which doesn't sound fast until you compare it to the previous speed of communication, which was however fast a horse could run. On May 24, 1844, Morse sat in the Supreme Court chamber in the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C., and sent a message over an experimental telegraph line to his colleague Alfred Vail, who was waiting at the Mount Clair Railroad Station in Baltimore, about 40 miles away. The message, chosen by the daughter of a friend from the Book of Numbers, was, "What hath God wrought?" And that message, those 4 words, traveled 40 miles in an instant, not in days, not in hours, in the time it took Morse to tap the key. For the first time in human history, a message had traveled faster than any human being could carry it. The distance between Washington and Baltimore, which would take a rider on horseback most of a day, had been collapsed to nothing, to less than a second, and the world responded immediately. Telegraph lines spread across the United States and Europe at a speed that's almost hard to believe. By 1850, there were over 12,000 miles of telegraph line in the United States alone. By 1852, Britain was connected to France by an undersea cable across the English Channel. And then someone had an idea that was either visionary or insane. Why not lay a cable across the Atlantic Ocean? The man who made this happen was Cyrus Field, a New York paper merchant who had retired wealthy at the age of 33 and was looking for something to do with his money and his energy. What he found was one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the 19th century. The Atlantic Ocean is about 2,000 miles wide at its narrowest point between Ireland and Newfoundland. The bottom is uneven, plunging to depths of over 2 miles in places. The cable itself had to be insulated against seawater, strong enough to withstand the pressure and the laying process, and capable of carrying an electrical signal over an enormous distance. Nobody had ever done anything remotely like this. Field tried and failed spectacularly. The first serious attempt was in 1857. The cable snapped after about 330 miles had been laid. The second attempt, in 1858, succeeded. The cable was completed on August 5th, and on August 16th, Queen Victoria sent a congratulatory message to President James Buchanan. The message, 98 words long, took 16.5 hours to transmit because the signal was so weak that each character had to be sent agonizingly slowly. But it worked, for a few weeks, and then the cable went dead. The chief electrician, Edward Whitehouse, had tried to boost the weak signal by applying dangerously high voltages, and the insulation failed. The cable was ruined. Millions of dollars, invested by Field and his backers, were lost. And then the Civil War started, and the project was shelved for years. But Field didn't give up. After the war, he tried again, this time with better cable, better equipment, and a better ship. The Great Eastern, the largest ship in the world at the time, one of Isambard Kingdom Brunel's engineering marvels. The 1865 attempt failed when the cable snapped 2/3 of the way across. The 1866 attempt succeeded. On July 27, 1866, a permanent, reliable transatlantic telegraph cable was operational, and this time the signal was clear and strong. A message from London to New York, which had previously taken at least 10 days by ship, now arrived in minutes. The two halves of the Atlantic world were connected in real time. Here's the thing about the telegraph that makes it so important in the history of communication. It didn't just speed things up. It fundamentally changed the relationship between information and distance. Before the telegraph, information and physical transport were inseparable. A message was a physical thing, a letter, a scroll, a spoken word carried by a runner, and it moved at the speed of its carrier. The telegraph severed that link. For the first time, information could travel independently of physical objects. A thought could move at the speed of electricity while the thinker stayed put. This was a conceptual revolution as much as a technological one, and its effects rippled outward into every aspect of society. Journalism was transformed overnight. Before the telegraph, newspapers relied on correspondents who sent their reports by mail. News from distant places was days or weeks old by the time it was published. After the telegraph, reporters could wire dispatches from battlefields, from foreign capitals, from disaster scenes, and have them published the same day. The concept of breaking news was born. The Associated Press, founded in 1846, was essentially created to share the cost of telegraph dispatches among multiple newspapers. The Wire Service, a news organization that distributes stories by telegraph to subscribing papers, became a new institution, and it wouldn't have existed without the telegraph. Financial markets were transformed even more dramatically. Before the telegraph, commodity prices in New York and London could differ substantially, because information about supply and demand took weeks to cross the Atlantic. Traders who got news first had an enormous advantage. After the transatlantic cable, prices in London and New York began to converge almost immediately. Arbitrage opportunities disappeared. Markets became more efficient, more integrated, more global. The telegraph didn't just connect markets. It created the global market in a very real sense. And here's something else the telegraph did, something subtler, but maybe more important in the long run. It created the idea of a network, not just a point-to-point connection, like a road or a shipping lane, but a branching, interconnected web of connections where any node could reach any other node through a series of relays. The telegraph network, at its peak, was the most complex communication system humanity had ever built, with tens of thousands of offices, connected by hundreds of thousands of miles of wire, operated by a specialized class of trained operators who formed their own subculture, complete with their own slang, their own social networks, their own romances, conducted entirely in Morse code. Some telegraph operators fell in love with people they'd never met, communicating only through the clicks of their keys. There's something wonderfully human about that. The technology changes, but the impulse to connect doesn't. But the telegraph had limitations. You needed a trained operator to send and receive messages. You couldn't just pick up a telegraph key and start tapping away. You needed to learn Morse code, and learning Morse code well enough to operate at professional speed took months of practice. The telegraph was a communications tool for businesses, newspapers, and governments. It was not a tool for ordinary people. An average person might send a telegram for a special occasion, a birth, a death, an emergency, but it wasn't something you used for everyday conversation. The cost was prohibitive, and the format was constraining. You paid by the word, so telegrams were famously terse. The entire culture of telegraphic communication was about compression, about stripping language down to its barest essentials. Stop. Send money stop. Arriving Tuesday stop. It was communication, but it wasn't conversation. And this is where someone had an idea that changed everything again. What if, instead of encoding messages as dots and dashes, You could send the human voice itself over a wire. What if you could talk to someone miles away, in real time, as naturally as if they were standing next to you? That idea, the telephone, would turn communication from a tool for specialists into a utility for everyone. And the story of its invention is one of the most contested, most dramatic, and most personally fascinating episodes in the history of technology. Because the man who got the patent, and the man who got the credit, and the man who may have actually invented it first, they're not necessarily the same person, and the arguments about who deserves credit have been raging for 150 years and show no sign of stopping. The name you know is Alexander Graham Bell, but there's another name, Elisha Gray, and the story of what happened between them on a single day in February 1876 is one of the great what-if moments in the history of invention. And to understand it properly, we need to talk about who these men were and what they were trying to do, because they came at the problem from completely different angles, and the fact that they arrived at almost the same solution at almost the same moment is one of those coincidences that makes you wonder whether ideas have their own kind of momentum, whether they become inevitable once the conditions are right. Alexander Graham Bell was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, in 1847, into a family that was obsessed with the mechanics of speech. His grandfather, also Alexander Bell, was an elocutionist, a teacher of public speaking. His father, Alexander Melville Bell, was a linguist who developed something called visible speech, a system of symbols representing the position and movement of the throat, tongue, and lips when producing any sound in any language. It was originally designed as a tool for teaching deaf people to speak, and it actually worked remarkably well. The young Alexander grew up steeped in the science of sound and the mechanics of the human voice. His mother was partially deaf, and he communicated with her by pressing his mouth against her forehead and speaking in low tones she could feel as vibrations. Sound, voice, vibration, deafness. These were the preoccupations of his family and his life. Bell became a teacher of the deaf, first in Scotland and England, then in Boston, where he moved in 1871. He was good at it, genuinely compassionate and inventive in his methods. And as he worked with deaf students, he became increasingly interested in the possibility of transmitting speech electrically. He was familiar with the telegraph, and he knew that telegraph wires could carry patterns of electrical current. The human voice, he reasoned, is a pattern of vibrations in air. If you could convert those vibrations into a corresponding pattern of electrical current, send that current over a wire, and then convert it back into vibrations at the other end, you'd have a telephone. The technical challenge was formidable. The telegraph sends a simple on-off signal, current or no current, dot or dash. A human voice is an incredibly complex wave, a continuously varying signal with multiple frequencies overlapping simultaneously. Converting that complex wave into an electrical signal, preserving enough of its structure to be recognizable as speech at the other end, and doing all of this with the primitive electronics of the 1870s, that was the problem. Bell worked on it for years, with the help of a skilled electrician named Thomas Watson, who was employed by a Boston electrical shop. Bell had the conceptual insight, the understanding of acoustics, and the vision of what was possible, and Watson had the practical skills to build the apparatus. They experimented with various designs, many of which failed, and gradually converged on a system that used a thin membrane, or diaphragm, that vibrated in response to sound waves. The vibrations caused a coil of wire to move in a magnetic field, which generated a varying electrical current that mirrored the vibrations. At the other end, the process was reversed. The varying current drove a speaker that reproduced the original sound waves. Meanwhile, about 500 miles away, Elisha Gray, an electrical engineer in Chicago, was working on almost exactly the same thing. Gray was a more experienced inventor than Bell. He'd already patented several telegraph improvements and was a co-founder of the Western Electric Company. He'd been experimenting with transmitting musical tones over wires and had gradually moved toward voice transmission. By early 1876, he had a working design that used a liquid transmitter, a needle connected to a diaphragm, dipping into a container of acidulated water, with the varying depth of the needle changing the electrical resistance and thus the current in a way that corresponded to the vibrations of the voice. And here's where the story becomes legendary and controversial. On February 14, 1876, Bell's lawyer filed a patent application at the U.S. Patent Office in Washington. That same day, the very same day, Elisha Gray's lawyer filed a caveat, which was a formal notice of intent to file a patent. Bell's application arrived first, by a matter of hours, and that sequence, those few hours, determined who would be remembered as the inventor of the telephone and who would be a footnote. Bell received the patent, number 174,465, on March 7, 1876. Gray challenged it in court, and the litigation dragged on for years, but Bell's patent was upheld. Now, there's been endless debate about whether Bell saw Gray's caveat and incorporated its ideas, specifically the liquid transmitter design, into his own work. Some historians have argued that Bell's laboratory notebooks show evidence of this. Others have defended Bell's originality. The truth is probably lost to history, buried under layers of legal maneuvering and self-serving recollection. What's clear is that both men independently arrived at workable designs for transmitting voice by wire at essentially the same moment, which suggests that the telephone, like many inventions, was less a stroke of individual genius and more an idea whose time had come, a solution that was almost inevitable given the state of technology and knowledge in the mid-1870s. And then there's a third name that deserves mention: Antonio Meucci, an Italian immigrant living in Staten Island, New York. Meucci had been experimenting with electromagnetic voice transmission as early as 1849, and in 1871, he filed a caveat with the Patent Office describing a talking telegraph. But he couldn't afford the $10 fee to renew the caveat in 1874, and it lapsed. He died in poverty in 1889, largely unrecognized. In 2002, the U.S. House of Representatives passed a resolution recognizing Meucci's contributions to the invention of the telephone, though it stopped short of calling him the inventor. History, as they say, is written by those who can afford the patent fees. But regardless of who deserves credit for the invention, what happened after the telephone was patented is a story of astonishing, explosive growth. Bell made his famous first telephone call on March 10, 1876. "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." And within just a few years, telephone exchanges were being built across the United States and Europe. The Bell Telephone Company was founded in 1877. By 1886, over 150,000 people in the United States had telephones. By 1900, over 600,000. And the growth only accelerated from there. The telephone did something the telegraph never could. It made real-time, voice-to-voice communication over distance accessible to ordinary people. You didn't need to know Morse code. You didn't need to go to a telegraph office. You just picked up the receiver and talked. And that simplicity changed the entire texture of daily life. Businesses could coordinate across distances in real time. Families separated by geography could hear each other's voices. Emergencies could be reported instantly. The phone became not just a convenience but a necessity, woven into the fabric of social and economic life in a way that the telegraph, for all its importance, never quite achieved, and the network grew in ways that created their own fascinating dynamics. Early telephones required dedicated wires between each pair of users. If you wanted to talk to 10 different people, you needed 10 separate wire connections. The solution was the telephone exchange, a central office where operators, almost all of them young women in the early days, would physically connect one caller to another by plugging a cord into a switchboard. These operators were the human routers of the telephone network, and the job was demanding. They needed to be fast, polite, and able to manage dozens of connections simultaneously. The switchboard operator became one of the most common jobs for women in America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It was repetitive, exhausting work, but it was also one of the few professional opportunities available to women at the time, and some operators took real pride in it. The automation of switching, replacing human operators with mechanical and eventually electronic switches, was a gradual process that took decades. The first automatic telephone exchange was patented in 1891 by Almon Stroger, an undertaker in Kansas City, who was convinced that the local telephone operator, who happened to be the wife of a competing undertaker, was routing his calls to his rival. Whether that story is true or apocryphal, Stroger's invention worked, and rotary dial phones, which allowed callers to directly dial the number they wanted without operator assistance, gradually spread through the 20th century. Each step in this automation removed a human intermediary from the communication process, making the network faster, cheaper, and more scalable. And each step followed the same pattern we've been seeing throughout this story. Technology that starts as a luxury for the few and gradually becomes a utility for everyone. But the telephone, revolutionary as it was, still required wires. Physical, copper wires strung on poles or buried in the ground, connecting every telephone to the network. And wires have a fundamental limitation. They go where you string them, and nowhere else. If you're on a ship, or in a remote area, or in a vehicle, you're out of reach. The next great leap in communication would sever that final physical connection, the wire itself, and send messages through thin air. And the person who first demonstrated this possibility, who proved that you could communicate without any physical connection between sender and receiver, was a young Italian inventor working in his parents' attic, experimenting with something that most of the scientific establishment thought was impossible. His name was Guglielmo Marconi, and what he was playing with, electromagnetic waves, the invisible ripples in the fabric of space that James Clerk Maxwell had predicted mathematically in 1865 and Heinrich Hertz had demonstrated physically in 1887, would give birth to radio, and eventually to the entire wireless world you live in today. And the story of how radio was born, like so many stories in the history of communication, begins with pure science and ends up reshaping civilization in ways nobody predicted. Maxwell's equations, those 4 elegant mathematical statements that unified electricity, magnetism, and light into a single framework, predicted that oscillating electric charges would produce waves that propagated through space at the speed of light. Hertz, working at the University of Bonn in the late 1880s, confirmed this prediction experimentally. He built a simple apparatus, a spark gap transmitter that generated electromagnetic waves, and a receiving loop that picked them up across the room. He proved that these waves behaved just like light. They could be reflected, refracted, and focused. But when someone asked Hertz what use these waves might have, he reportedly replied, "It's of no use whatsoever. This is just an experiment that proves Maestro Maxwell was right." He didn't see a practical application. Hertz died of a rare blood vessel disease in 1894, at the age of 36. He never knew what his discovery would become. But Marconi saw it. Guglielmo Marconi was born in 1874 in Bologna, Italy, to an Italian father and an Irish mother. His mother, Annie Jameson, yes, from the Jameson whiskey family, was well-connected and ambitious for her son. Young Marconi was not a distinguished student, but he was intensely curious about electricity, and when he read about Hertz's experiments, something clicked. He began experimenting in the attic of his family's villa at Pontecchio, near Bologna, in 1894 and 1895. He improved on Hertz's equipment, adding an antenna, which dramatically increased the range, and a ground connection, and a device called a coherer that could detect faint signals. Step by step, he extended the range of his transmissions, from across a room, to across the garden, to across a hill, to over a mile. When the Italian government showed little interest, Marconi's mother used her connections to introduce him to influential people in England. In 1896, at the age of 22, he traveled to London, filed for a patent, and began demonstrating his apparatus to increasingly astonished audiences. In 1897, he transmitted a signal across the Bristol Channel, about 9 miles. In 1899, he sent a signal across the English Channel, from Wimereux in France to South Foreland in England, about 32 miles. And then, in December 1901, Marconi attempted something that many scientists said was physically impossible. He tried to send a wireless signal across the Atlantic Ocean. The scientific objection was straightforward. Radio waves, like light, travel in straight lines. The Earth is curved. A signal sent from England should shoot off into space in a straight line and never reach North America, because the curvature of the Earth would be in the way. But Marconi either didn't know this or didn't care. He set up a massive transmitting station at Poldhu, in Cornwall, England, and traveled to St. John's, Newfoundland, where he set up a receiving station. On December 12, 1901, using an antenna lifted by a kite in howling winds, he claimed to have received the Morse code letter S, 3 dots, transmitted from 3,500 miles away. Whether he actually received that signal has been debated ever since. The conditions were terrible. The signal would have been incredibly faint, and there was no independent confirmation. Many scientists were skeptical, but subsequent experiments proved that transatlantic wireless communication was indeed possible, and the reason it worked, the reason radio waves could follow the curve of the Earth, was something Marconi hadn't anticipated. The upper atmosphere contains a layer of ionized gas, the ionosphere, that reflects radio waves back toward the ground, allowing them to bounce between the surface and the ionosphere and travel around the planet's curve. Oliver Heaviside in England and Arthur Kennelly in America independently predicted this reflecting layer in 1902, and its existence was confirmed experimentally in the 1920s. Marconi's achievement made him a global celebrity. He won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1909, sharing it with Carl Ferdinand Braun, who had independently made important contributions to wireless technology. But what really cemented the importance of radio in the public imagination was not a scientific achievement, but a disaster. On April 14, 1912, the RMS Titanic struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic and began to sink. The ship's wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, both employees of the Marconi Company, sent distress signals that were picked up by the Carpathia, which changed course and arrived in time to rescue over 700 survivors. Without wireless telegraphy, there would have been no way to summon help. Everyone would have died. The Titanic disaster shocked the world, but it also demonstrated, in the most visceral way possible, that wireless communication could save lives. In the aftermath, regulations were passed requiring all large ships to carry wireless equipment and maintain a 24-hour radio watch. But here's the thing about early radio. It was still telegraphy, dots and dashes, Morse code. The human voice couldn't be transmitted wirelessly using the spark gap technology Marconi had pioneered. For voice transmission, what we'd recognize as broadcast radio, you needed a different kind of signal, a continuous wave that could be modulated to carry the complex patterns of speech. And the technology that made this possible was the vacuum tube, developed in the early 1900s by Lee De Forest and others. De Forest's Audion tube, patented in 1907, could amplify weak electrical signals, and it could generate continuous radio waves that could be modulated, varied in amplitude or frequency, to carry voice and music. The first public radio broadcast is a matter of debate. Several people have claimed the honor. Reginald Fessenden, a Canadian engineer, transmitted voice and music from Brant Rock, Massachusetts, on Christmas Eve 1906, and ship's radio operators heard it through their headphones with astonishment. But regular, scheduled broadcasting didn't begin until the early 1920s. Station K-Daka in Pittsburgh is often cited as the first commercial radio station in the United States, beginning regular broadcasts on November 2, 1920, with coverage of the Harding-Cox presidential election results. Within just a few years, radio exploded. By 1922, there were over 500 licensed radio stations in the United States. By the end of the 1920s, radio was in over 12 million American homes. And radio did something that no previous communication technology had done. It broadcast. The telegraph sent a message from one point to one other point. The telephone connected two people. Radio sent a signal from one point to everyone within range. One person could talk, and millions could listen simultaneously. This was new. This was revolutionary, and its implications for culture, politics, and society were immense. Radio created mass culture in a way that newspapers and books never quite could. When millions of people listen to the same program at the same time, they share an experience. They have something to talk about the next morning. Radio programs, comedy shows, dramas, news broadcasts, sports coverage became shared cultural touchstones. Families gathered around the radio the way they'd later gather around the television. President Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats, broadcast by radio during the Great Depression and World War II, allowed him to speak directly to the American public in a calm, intimate, almost conversational tone, bypassing the newspapers and creating a personal connection with millions of listeners. It was a new kind of political communication, and it was extraordinarily effective. But radio also demonstrated, with terrible clarity, the power of mass communication in the wrong hands. Adolf Hitler and Joseph Goebbels understood radio's power instinctively. The Nazi regime distributed cheap, mass-produced radio receivers, the Volksempfänger, the People's Receiver, and used them to pipe propaganda directly into German homes. Goebbels called radio the eighth great power, and he used it ruthlessly, filling the airwaves with speeches, rallies, and carefully crafted messaging that helped consolidate the Nazi regime's grip on power. The same technology that let Roosevelt calm a frightened nation let Goebbels poison one. The medium doesn't care about the message, it just transmits. And that lesson, that communication technology is morally neutral, that it amplifies whatever is fed into it, for good or for ill. That's one of the most important threads running through this entire story. Every new communication technology brings with it utopian hopes and dystopian fears, and the reality is always more complicated than either. The printing press spread both the Reformation and anti-Semitic propaganda. The telegraph connected the world and enabled more efficient colonial exploitation. Radio gave us Roosevelt's fireside chats and Goebbels's propaganda. The pattern repeats because the technology isn't the actor, it's the stage. The humans are the actors, and humans are complicated. Now, while radio was transforming how people received information, another technology was being developed that would add a visual dimension to broadcasting and change the world yet again: television. And the story of television's invention is messy, contentious, and involves a cast of characters that includes a farm boy from Idaho, a Russian immigrant working in a Pittsburgh lab, and one of the most powerful corporations in America. The idea of transmitting images electrically goes back at least to the 1880s, when several inventors proposed systems using selenium photocells, which changed their electrical resistance when exposed to light. But making it work required solving an enormous technical problem: scanning. A camera captures an entire image at once, but an electrical wire can only carry one signal at a time, so you have to break the image down into tiny pieces, transmit them one after another in rapid sequence, and reassemble them at the other end fast enough that the human eye sees a complete, moving picture rather than a series of dots. You need to scan the image, line by line, point by point, at least 30 times per second. Philo Farnsworth, born in 1906 in a log cabin in Beaver, Utah, conceived of an electronic scanning system while he was still a teenager, literally while plowing a potato field, according to the famous story. He noticed the parallel furrows in the field and imagined an electron beam scanning back and forth across a screen in the same pattern, painting an image line by line. By 1927, at the age of 21, working in a small laboratory in San Francisco, funded by investors, he successfully demonstrated the first fully electronic television system. He transmitted the image of a simple line and then a dollar sign. His investors wanted to see something with money in it, naturally. Meanwhile, Vladimir Zworykin, a Russian-born engineer working at RCA under the patronage of the powerful David Sarnoff, was working on his own electronic television system. Zworykin had filed patents as early as 1923, though his early devices didn't fully work. RCA, with its enormous resources, backed Zworykin's research heavily. When Farnsworth's system proved superior, RCA tried to buy him out. Farnsworth refused. RCA sued. The patent battles dragged on for years, and Farnsworth eventually won. The courts ruled that he had priority on the key inventions. But by the time the legal battles were resolved, RCA had used its market power and manufacturing capacity to dominate the television industry, and Farnsworth, bitter and broken, faded into obscurity. He struggled with depression and alcoholism and died in 1971, largely forgotten. When Neil Armstrong walked on the moon in 1969, the images were captured by a television camera, a descendant of Farnsworth's invention, and Farnsworth, watching from his living room, reportedly told his wife, "This has made it all worthwhile." Television changed everything about how humans receive information and entertainment. It combined the immediacy of radio with the power of visual imagery. News could now show you what was happening, not just tell you. When Americans saw images of police dogs and fire hoses being turned on civil rights protesters in Birmingham, Alabama, in 1963, the visual impact was devastating, far more powerful than any written report could have been. Television coverage of the Vietnam War brought the reality of combat into American living rooms in a way that fundamentally altered public opinion about the war. The Kennedy-Nixon debates of 1960, the first televised presidential debates, famously demonstrated that how a candidate looked on camera could matter more than what they said. Kennedy appeared calm and confident. Nixon, recovering from an illness and refusing makeup, looked sweaty and uncomfortable. Radio listeners thought Nixon won the debate. Television viewers thought Kennedy won. The medium had become the message, just as Marshall McLuhan would famously argue. And McLuhan, let's talk about him for a second, because he saw what was happening more clearly than almost anyone. Herbert Marshall McLuhan, a Canadian media theorist working at the University of Toronto, published Understanding Media in 1964, and his central insight was deceptively simple but extraordinarily powerful. The medium through which you receive a message shapes your perception of the message more than the content itself does. "The medium is the message," was his famous phrase. And what he meant was that the technology of communication isn't just a neutral carrier of content. It fundamentally alters how people think, how societies organize, how reality is perceived. Print culture creates one kind of society: linear, individualistic, analytical. Television creates another: immersive, tribal, image-driven. McLuhan was ridiculed by many academics and embraced by the counterculture. He appeared in Woody Allen films. He made cryptic pronouncements on talk shows, but his core insight, that the form of communication matters as much as the content, has been validated again and again, and it's more relevant now than ever, in an age when the medium is an algorithm and the message is whatever keeps you scrolling. And by the mid-20th century, the world's communication infrastructure was astonishingly complex. Telegraph networks spanned the globe. Telephone networks connected hundreds of millions of people. Radio and television broadcasts reached billions. Undersea cables crossed every ocean. Communication satellites began orbiting the Earth in the 1960s. Telstar, launched in 1962, relayed the first live transatlantic television signal, and by the 1970s, a global network of geostationary satellites provided continuous coverage. The world was, in a very real sense, wired. And yet, all of these technologies, telegraph, telephone, radio, television, shared a fundamental characteristic. They were analog. They transmitted information as continuous signals, smooth variations in electrical current or electromagnetic waves. And they were, for the most part, separate systems. Your telephone network was different from your television network, which was different from your telegraph network. Each medium had its own infrastructure, its own protocols, its own limitations. The revolution that was about to change all of that, the revolution that would converge all these separate streams into a single, universal, digital torrent of information, had its roots in a place we've already mentioned, though in a different context. It started at the intersection of military paranoia, academic curiosity, and a few people asking a question that nobody else had thought to ask. What if computers could talk to each other? And the answer to that question, worked out over decades by hundreds of people in dozens of institutions, would become the most transformative communication technology since the invention of writing itself. But before we get to the internet, because that's where this is heading, and you probably knew it, we need to talk about the foundation it was built on. And that foundation is digital. The idea that all information, text, images, sound, video, everything, can be represented as numbers, as ones and zeros, as bits. Now, the word digital comes from the Latin word for finger, digitus, because we count on our fingers. And the idea of representing information digitally isn't new. Morse code is digital, in a sense. Dots and dashes, on and off, 1 and 0. But the full theoretical framework for digital information was laid out in 1948 by a quiet, brilliant mathematician at Bell Labs named Claude Shannon. And Shannon's contribution to the history of communication is so fundamental, so transformative, that some people call him the father of the information age, which is, if anything, an understatement. Shannon published a paper in 1948 called A Mathematical Theory of Communication, and it's one of those papers that reads like someone casually reinventing a field of science from scratch. What Shannon did was create a rigorous mathematical framework for thinking about information itself, not about any particular kind of information, not about words or sounds or images specifically, but about information in general. He defined a unit of information, the bit, short for binary digit, as the amount of information needed to distinguish between two equally likely possibilities: yes or no, heads or tails, 0 or 1. And he showed that any kind of information, no matter how complex, a symphony, a photograph, a novel, a conversation, could be represented as a sequence of bits. That's a profound claim, and it's true. Shannon also proved something even more remarkable. He showed that there's a maximum rate at which information can be reliably transmitted over any communication channel, depending on the channel's bandwidth and its noise level. This maximum rate is called the Shannon limit, or the channel capacity, and it's a fundamental law of nature, as inviolable as the speed of light in physics. You can get arbitrarily close to the Shannon limit with clever enough encoding, but you can never exceed it. This gave engineers, for the first time, a theoretical benchmark. They knew exactly how good their communication systems could possibly be, and they could measure how close they were getting. Shannon's theory unified the field. Before Shannon, communication engineering was a collection of separate specialties: telephony, telegraphy, radio engineering, television engineering, each with its own techniques and its own jargon. After Shannon, they were all branches of a single discipline: information theory. And information theory provided the conceptual foundation for everything that came next: digital computers, digital telecommunications, data compression, error correction, encryption, the internet, the smartphone. All of it rests on Shannon's framework. And the beautiful thing, the thing that might strike you as you're lying there, thinking about this, is how many of these revolutions were set in motion by quiet people, working on abstract problems. Shannon wasn't trying to invent the internet. He was trying to understand information, mathematically. Hertz wasn't trying to invent radio. He was trying to verify Maxwell's equations. Turing wasn't trying to build a computer. He was trying to answer a question in mathematical logic. Over and over, the most world-changing technologies have emerged not from people trying to build products, but from people trying to understand nature. The curiosity comes first. The applications follow, often decades later, and often in ways the original thinkers never imagined. Now, let's get to the internet, because this is, in a very real sense, the culmination of everything we've been talking about. Every communication technology in human history, speech, writing, printing, telegraphy, telephony, radio, television, the internet absorbs them all. It carries text, voice, images, video, music, software, data, everything, all on the same network, all using the same underlying digital infrastructure. It's the universal communication medium that humanity spent 5,000 years building toward without knowing it. And the story of how it began is, like so many stories in this narrative, deeply human and surprisingly small in its origins. It starts in the late 1960s, at the height of the Cold War, with a worry about nuclear attack. The U.S. Department of Defense, through its Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, later renamed DARPA, was funding computer science research at universities across the country. These universities had expensive mainframe computers, and ARPA wanted them to be able to share resources, to let a researcher at UCLA use a computer at MIT, for example, without physically traveling there. And there was a strategic concern as well. The existing communication networks, telephone and telegraph, were centralized. They had central switching offices that routed all traffic. In a nuclear war, taking out a few central nodes could cripple the entire network. Paul Barron, a researcher at the Rand Corporation, had proposed a solution to this vulnerability in the early 1960s. Instead of a centralized network with a few critical nodes, build a distributed network with many redundant paths between any 2 points. And instead of sending messages as continuous streams along a dedicated circuit, the way telephone calls worked, break each message into small pieces, called packets, and let each packet find its own way through the network independently, being reassembled at the destination. This way, if any part of the network was destroyed, the packets could simply route around the damage. This concept, packet switching, was also developed independently by Donald Davies at the National Physical Laboratory in England, who coined the term, and it became the foundation of the ARPANET, the network that ARPA began building in 1969. The first ARPANET connection was established on October 29, 1969, between a computer at UCLA and a computer at Stanford Research Institute, about 350 miles apart. The first message was supposed to be "log in," but the system crashed after the first two letters. The first message ever sent over the precursor to the Internet was "LO," which, if you think about it, is kind of perfect. Lo and behold, an accidental prophecy. The ARPANET grew slowly at first. By the end of 1969, it connected 4 nodes. By 1971, there were 15. And in 1971, something happened that, in retrospect, might have been the most significant development in the early history of the network, even though nobody realized it at the time. A programmer named Ray Tomlinson, working at the technology firm BBN in Cambridge, Massachusetts, wrote a program that let users send messages to each other across the ARPANET. He chose the @ symbol, just sitting there on the keyboard, barely used, to separate the user's name from the name of their computer. And with that small decision, email was born. Email was not what ARPA had in mind when they built the ARPANET. The network was supposed to be about sharing computing resources, letting researchers use distant computers remotely. Email was a side project, almost an afterthought. But within a year, email was the most popular use of the ARPANET. By a huge margin, the engineers had built a network to share computing power, and the humans immediately used it to talk to each other. The technology's designers had one vision, the users had another, and the users won. This is another pattern that repeats throughout the history of communication. The most transformative uses of a new technology are almost never the ones its creators intended. Through the 1970s and 1980s, computer networking grew, but it was fragmented. The ARPANET was one network. Universities were building their own networks. Companies had internal networks. Military networks were separate. These networks used different protocols, different languages essentially, and couldn't easily communicate with each other. What was missing was a universal protocol, a common language that would let any network communicate with any other network. And creating that universal protocol was the work of 2 people, primarily, Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn. In 1974, Cerf and Kahn published a paper describing what they called a protocol for packet network intercommunication. It eventually evolved into TCP/IP, Transmission Control Protocol, and Internet Protocol, the fundamental rules that govern how data is broken into packets, addressed, transmitted, and reassembled across interconnected networks. And the key word there is interconnected. The inter in Internet. TCP/IP didn't just connect computers to a network. It connected networks to each other, creating a network of networks, an internetwork, shortened to Internet. On January 1, 1983, the ARPANET officially switched to TCP/IP, and the Internet, as a technical reality, was born. But for another decade, the Internet remained a tool for academics, researchers, and military personnel. It was text-based, command-line driven, and about as user-friendly as a brick. To use it, you needed to know arcane commands, navigate cryptic interfaces, and have access to a university or research institution's network. The general public had no idea it existed, and if they'd seen it, they wouldn't have known what to do with it. What transformed the internet from a niche research tool into the defining technology of the modern era was something invented by a British physicist working at a particle physics laboratory in Switzerland. His name was Tim Berners-Lee. He worked at CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, near Geneva, and in 1989, he wrote a proposal for an information management system that would use hypertext, clickable links that could connect documents stored on different computers anywhere on the network. He called it the World Wide Web. Berners-Lee wrote the first web browser, the first web server, and the first website, all in 1990 and 1991. His system used three key technologies: HTML, a markup language for creating web pages, HTTP, a protocol for transferring them, and URLs, a system for addressing them. And crucially, he made all of it freely available. No patents, no licenses, no fees. Anyone could build a website. Anyone could build a browser. Anyone could use the system without paying Berners-Lee a cent. He has said, repeatedly, that this decision, to make the web an open, free standard, was essential to its success. If he'd tried to charge for it, the web might never have taken off. The web made the internet visual, intuitive, and accessible. Instead of typing commands, you could click links. Instead of reading plain text, you could see formatted pages with images. And with the release of the Mosaic browser in 1993, developed by Mark Andreessen and Eric Bina at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications at the University of Illinois, the web became genuinely easy to use. Mosaic displayed images in line with text, had a point-and-click interface, and ran on personal computers. It was the gateway drug that brought millions of people online for the first time. And there's something poetic about who Berners-Lee is and where he was working. CERN is a physics laboratory. Its mission is to study the fundamental structure of matter. And it was there, surrounded by people trying to understand quarks and bosons and the basic building blocks of the universe, that someone invented the tool that would reorganize human civilization. Berners-Lee wasn't trying to change the world. He was trying to help physicists share data more easily. Just like the Sumerians weren't trying to invent literature when they counted grain, the biggest revolutions always seem to start as someone solving a practical problem, and then the growth became explosive. In 1993, there were about 130 websites in the world. By 1996, there were over 100,000. By 2000, over 17 million. The internet went from an academic curiosity to a global platform for commerce, communication, entertainment, education, and everything else in less than a decade. Amazon was founded in 1994, eBay in 1995, Google in 1998. The dot-com boom inflated and burst, destroying hundreds of billions of dollars in market value between 2000 and 2002. But the underlying technology survived and kept growing. And alongside the web, another revolution was happening, one that would eventually merge with the internet to create the world you're lying in right now. Mobile telephony, the cellular phone. And the story of how phones went from devices bolted to walls to devices in everyone's pockets is another fascinating chapter in the history of communication, because it involved solving a problem that seemed almost impossible. How do you let thousands of people make wireless phone calls simultaneously in the same city without their signals interfering with each other? The answer was the cellular concept, developed at Bell Labs in the 1940s and 1950s, though it took decades to implement. The idea was to divide a geographic area into small zones, cells, each served by a low-power transmitter. Because the transmitters were low power, the same radio frequencies could be reused in non-adjacent cells, without interference. As a user moved from one cell to another, Their call would be handed off from one transmitter to the next, seamlessly. The concept was elegant, but the technology to implement it, the switching, the handoff algorithms, the miniaturization of the electronics, took years to develop. Martin Cooper, an engineer at Motorola, made the first public mobile phone call on April 3, 1973, standing on a street in New York City. He called Joel Engel, his rival at Bell Labs, just to rub it in. The phone weighed about 2.5 pounds and had a battery life of about 20 minutes. Commercial cellular service didn't launch in the United States until 1983. The Dynatac 8000X, the first commercially available handheld mobile phone, cost nearly $4,000, weighed about 1.5 pounds, and took 10 hours to charge for 30 minutes of talk time. It was a luxury item, a status symbol, something you saw in the hands of Wall Street traders and Hollywood executives. The idea that everyone would have one, that children would have one, would have seemed absurd. But the technology improved rapidly. Phones got smaller, cheaper, and more capable. By the early 2000s, mobile phones were becoming ubiquitous. And then something happened that changed their nature entirely. On January 9, 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and introduced the iPhone. And while Apple didn't invent the smartphone, devices like the BlackBerry and Nokia's internet-enabled phones existed before. The iPhone did something that no previous device had done so successfully. It combined a phone, a camera, a music player, a web browser, an email client, a GPS navigator, and an app platform into a single, intuitive, pocket-sized device with a touchscreen interface. And when the App Store launched in 2008, it turned the iPhone and the Android phones that followed into universal devices that could do almost anything: communication, navigation, entertainment, banking, shopping, photography, health monitoring, education, all from a device in your pocket, and all of it connected to the internet. The smartphone completed a journey that started with smoke signals and cave paintings. The entire apparatus of human communication, text, voice, images, video, real-time conversation, broadcast, one-to-many, and many-to-many, and one-to-one, all of it collapsed into a single device small enough to hold in your hand. And almost everyone has one. As of the mid-2020s, there are over 6 billion smartphone users worldwide. That's more than 75% of the world's population carrying a device that gives them access to essentially all of human knowledge, all the time. And alongside the smartphone came social media, which created entirely new forms of communication that didn't have precedence in the pre-digital world. Facebook, launched in 2004, gave people a platform to broadcast their lives, photos, thoughts, milestones, to networks of friends and acquaintances. Twitter, launched in 2006, created a global real-time public conversation in 280-character bursts. YouTube, also 2006, let anyone broadcast video to the world. Instagram, WhatsApp, TikTok, Snapchat. Each one created new modes of expression and connection that previous generations couldn't have imagined. A teenager in Jakarta can post a video that's seen by 50 million people in a week. A protest movement in one country can be organized through encrypted messaging apps and broadcast to the world through social media before traditional news outlets even know it's happening. But here's the thing, and this is important, because the pattern is repeating yet again. Social media has also amplified every dysfunction of human communication to a degree that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. Misinformation spreads faster than truth, because lies are often more emotionally engaging than facts. Algorithms designed to maximize engagement push users toward more extreme content, because outrage and fear are powerful engagement drivers. Cyberbullying, harassment, election interference, radicalization, addiction, the erosion of shared reality. These are not accidental side effects of social media. They're structural consequences of systems designed to capture and hold attention, operating at a scale and speed that no previous communication technology ever achieved. The printing press took decades to reshape European society. Social media reshapes public discourse in real time, every day, continuously. And that same tension we've been tracing since the very first scribes in Sumer, between communication as liberation and communication as control, between the power to inform and the power to manipulate, that tension has never been more acute than it is right now. We have more access to more information than any humans in history. We can communicate with anyone, anywhere, instantly. And we are also more vulnerable to manipulation, more overwhelmed by noise, more uncertain about what's true than perhaps any previous generation. The tools are more powerful. The challenges are correspondingly larger. And now, as you're lying there, something new is emerging. Something that may represent the next great transformation in the history of communication, though it's too early to know for certain. Artificial intelligence, and specifically large language models, are beginning to change not just how information is transmitted, but how it's created. Systems that can generate text, translate languages, summarize documents, answer questions, write code, compose music. These are blurring the line between human communication and machine communication in ways that nobody quite knows how to handle. When you receive a message, an article, a piece of advice, a creative work, was it written by a human? By an AI? By some collaboration between the two? Does it matter? These are questions that would have seemed absurd even 10 years ago, and now they're urgent. And here's what strikes me about the whole arc of this story. From the cave paintings at Lascaux to the AI-generated text on your screen, every revolution in communication has followed the same basic pattern. Someone figures out a new way to encode, transmit, or preserve information. The new technology starts as a curiosity or a tool for elites. It gradually becomes cheaper and more accessible. It disrupts existing power structures and creates new ones. It enables new forms of creativity and connection. And it also enables new forms of manipulation and control. Every time, people initially underestimate how profoundly the technology will change society. And every time, the most important uses of the technology turn out to be ones that its creators never anticipated. The Sumerians invented writing to count grain, and it became the foundation of law, literature, and science. Gutenberg wanted to print Bibles efficiently, and he unleashed the Reformation and the scientific revolution. The ARPANET was built to share computing resources, and people used it to send each other messages. The smartphone was designed to make phone calls easier, and it became the universal interface to all of human knowledge. The pattern is consistent. The technology creates the possibility, and humans, being humans, find uses for it that go far beyond what anyone planned. And maybe that's the most important thing to carry with you from all of this. Communication technology is, at its core, a mirror. It reflects who we are, our curiosity and our cruelty, our creativity and our laziness, our desire to connect and our desire to dominate. The technology itself is neutral. It's a tool, and every tool is only as good or as bad as the hand that wields it and the mind that directs it. Right now, as you settle in and let your thoughts slow down, the whole immense apparatus of human communication is humming along around you. Satellites are orbiting overhead, relaying television signals and GPS coordinates and weather data. Undersea cables are carrying the heartbeat of the global internet across ocean floors. Cell towers are blinking on hilltops and rooftops, handing off calls as people move through the night. Somewhere, a teenager is posting a video. Somewhere else, a scientist is emailing a colleague on another continent about a breakthrough that might change medicine. Somewhere, a grandmother is video calling her grandchild. Somewhere, someone is reading a book, an object that would have been inconceivably precious 500 years ago and is now as common as a spoon. All of this, every text, every call, every streaming video, every email, every website, all of it traces back to the same impulse that drove someone, tens of thousands of years ago, to grind up red ochre, mix it with animal fat, and press their hand against a cave wall in the flickering light of a tallow lamp. I am here. I want you to know. Remember me. That impulse hasn't changed. The technology has gone from pigment on stone to light through glass, from spoken words that die in the air to digital signals that circle the globe in milliseconds. But the impulse is the same. We are a species that needs to communicate, that aches to be understood. That builds entire civilizations around the simple, fundamental, unquenchable desire to take what's inside one mind and put it into another. And tonight, right now, that's what's happening. These words, however you're receiving them, are a communication, a thought, moving from one mind toward yours, using technology that thousands of years of human ingenuity have made possible. It's a chain that stretches back through time, through the smartphone engineers and the web developers and the fiber optic technicians and the radio pioneers and the telegraph operators and the printing press workers and the scribes and the cave painters, all of them part of this single, unbroken, astonishing effort to connect across distance and time. And you're at the end of that chain, right now, tonight, the latest in a long, long line of people who received a message and understood it. That's worth something. That's worth a lot, actually. So let that thought settle in as your breathing slows and the weight of the day lifts off you. The world is full of signals tonight, full of messages and connections and voices reaching out through the darkness. You don't need to listen to all of them. You don't need to listen to any of them. The messages will still be there in the morning. The technology will keep humming. The signals will keep flying. And somewhere, right now, someone is pressing send on a message to someone they love, and the whole vast, intricate, improbable apparatus of human communication, 5,000 years of invention and ingenuity, and stubborn refusal to accept that distance should mean silence, is carrying that message home. Sleep well. The world is talking, and it will still be talking when you wake.